Europe in crisis? Are sovereign debt and populism threatening EU solidarity? In the interview, Hannes Swoboda, head of the European Parliament's Socialist group.
Mr. Swoboda, have we survived the euro crisis, or is there worse to come?
If I knew the answer to that, I could earn a lot of money and gain a lot of fame. I'm very cautious. I believe we need to be prepared for many more years, or at least months, of crisis and tough decisions, especially if we want to prevent a similar situation in the future.
I'll come back to the crisis in just a moment, but first let's start with a brief look at your biography. You were born in 1946 in Austria, shortly after World War II. What are your memories of post-war Austria?
I was born in the Soviet-occupied zone. I remember the Iron Curtain. There were a lot of bombed-out buildings in Vienna. The Russians, as we called the Soviet occupation powers, were nice to us children. But there was a sense of threat. As I said, I was born just a few kilometers away from the Iron Curtain. Today's Europe is completely different, but we shouldn't forget how it used to be. At least my generation shouldn't. Of course, we also shouldn't forget what it was like before the Soviet occupation. There was a terrible war.
You then moved to Vienna, studied law, and later you had a career in the Social Democrat Party of Austria. When did you realize that you wanted to pursue politics as a career?
At the time, we had a chancellor, Bruno Kreisky, who had already had a long career as foreign minister. He fascinated me because he was so liberal-minded. He was an Austrian social democrat whose roots went back to what was once a bigger Austria. Like my grandparents, his parents came from former Moravia, and I was really interested in that. Then there were the conflicts in Indochina, Algeria, and Congo. I was intrigued that the world was so unsettled and that it was so difficult to find peace. All those things had a very big influence on me in the early 1960s.
You spent 2 decades in Vienna city politics until 1996. Then you switched and became a member of the European Parliament. Were you bored with local politics?
No, it's very interesting, but I felt that there were going to be political changes, that the Social Democrats were about to lose the ability to govern on their own. I wanted to do something new. For many years, I was responsible for city planning in Vienna. I was very content with that, but I wanted a new project, Europe.
Now you're a member of the European Parliament. You head a group of 190 parliamentarians from all of the EU's 27 nations. Isn't it difficult to hold something like that together?
Sometimes it's difficult and sometimes it's easy when there are common views or thoughts on how Europe should take shape. Naturally, there's a lot of debate. There's a much bigger need for discussion in a European grouping than in a national party. We don't have a party leader who gives orders. There's no head of government to point us in the right direction. We have to decide that ourselves, and I think that's a good thing. Democracy is held in very high esteem at the European level, even if we are very distant from the citizens who frequently don't see how democratic it is in the various European institutions. At least that's the case in the European Parliament.
That's the alliance of Socialists and the Democrats. Which is the more dominant?
The Democrats are an Italian party that belong neither to the Socialists nor the European Social Democratic Party. Actually, we're Social Democrats who inhabit the middle of the political spectrum. Of course, we have a left-wing point of view, which means we favor economic growth and jobs, but also social justice. Those are our main goals.
Gerechtigkeit anstreben, das sind unsere wesentlichen Zielsetzungen.
It appears to me that when push comes to shove, national interests play a more important role for the members of Parliament than their allegiance to a political grouping.
Yes and no. My predecessor, Martin Schuster, was often able to weld us together. However, that sometimes leads to the problem that our members vote in a different way here than they do at home. and that's interpreted as flouting their national interests. Of course, there are national interests. It would be foolish to deny that. But if there is a force that's European, then it's the groupings, especially the social democratic groups in the European Parliament, who really think about Europe's needs. And mostly, they will deal in Europe's interests. Not always, but mostly.
In almost every EU country, you can see that national governments are gaining greater importance because of the debt crisis. At the same time, the supranational European project has moved into the background. Does that unsettle you as a European politician?
Yes, that does worry me a lot. I think we've lost the drive towards Europe that existed after the war, after the Iron Curtain fell, and after all the new countries joined the EU. That's because many countries only see their own national interests. My argument is that that type of nationalism only serves short-term national interests, not mid- or long-term interests. It's not enough to promote only our national industries. We cannot only work on a national level when China, India, and the U.S. are doing otherwise. If we fail to unite and become as strong as the big powers, then we will all lose collectively. That not only applies to small countries like my home country, Austria, it also applies to Britain. A short time ago, I visited the Lion's Lair, the City of London, and the traders there told me the following: we don't need a conservative government to defend us. We want to have Europe because the investors who come to London or to Frankfurt also want to do business with the whole of Europe. They want to trade in Europe and hopefully also to create jobs in Europe. That's why it would be a short-term solution to reinstate the borders. During national election campaigns, politicians tend to revert back to old habits, as the French president did recently. But I believe that if you are really interested in the people, then you must favor Europe.
Wenn man wirklich die Interessen der Menschen vertritt, dann muss man für Europa sein.
There is resurgent nationalism, populism in many countries, even here in the European Parliament. Is that a reaction to the euro crisis, or is this crisis in Europe not much, much deeper? And has it not overtaken the debt crisis? Does it not go to the very heart of Europe?
On one hand, some people here are very happy about the crisis. There are members of Parliament who would be happy if the Parliament ceased to exist. Some expect Parliament will continue to exist, but argue against Europe. It wins them votes. Secondly, it's not just a euro crisis. Europe is experiencing a political crisis and a moral crisis at the moment. That is the case. There is resistance precisely because Europe is uniting and will be a single body one day. In that situation, there are opposing forces that say, we oppose that because we're trying to get re-elected and that's more important for us. There's a danger of that happening. We have too few responsible politicians with the courage to counter the voters who say, stop talking about Europe. They must declare their support for Europe with clear knowledge of the alternative. Soon it will be May 9th, Europe Day. Perhaps we shouldn't have a Europe Day. We should have a No Europe Day, and then the people would see what it's like when passports are reintroduced, when borders are reinstated, and when forces grow that say, only my company can bid for a job, and only my employees can work here. I would like to see what Europe would look like then. It would be a catastrophe.
Could you be more precise? What forces are you talking about? Who's responsible for this deepening European crisis?
When Merkel and Sarkozy say, we don't need these European institutions, we'll make our own deals, and when they only engage in austerity policies and say that the only way forward is lower wages, lower salaries, that poses two dangers. First, what they're doing is outside the European institutions, and secondly, they're advocating the wrong policies. I'm not the type of person who says Merkel is terrible, awful. No, Merkel knows she needs Europe, but she often speaks in a language that does not advance Europe but takes it backwards. Sarkozy is much worse, and we have many politicians in Europe who only think in the short term. I know of only a few heads of government who are visionaries, with a clear idea of how things should be, and who don't primarily think about their own short-term interests.
Die wirklich Visionen haben, wie es weitergehen soll, und die nicht primär ihr eigenes kurzfristiges Interesse im Auge haben.
I can tell from what you're saying, and because you're a social democrat, that you don't want Sarkozy to win the French presidential election. You would rather see his socialist opponent, François Hollande, win. Do you think that Hollande can deliver on what he's promising in the election campaign?
You have guessed correctly. I support François Hollande because then a different type of Franco-German axis can develop. That will open up a heated debate and friction. Sarkozy is like the waiter in that sketch who's serving Merkel. He's not really a person who can oppose her. I have to be honest, no politician can live up to every expectation because situations change. But Sarkozy's main message is that his policies are not just about austerity, not just about cutbacks, and that they're aimed at establishing budgetary stability. He says he wants more growth and more employment, because then there will be more people paying taxes and more income for governments. François Hollande will put that message into action. I believe that.
Hollande favors renegotiating the fiscal pact that's meant to bring more stability to the euro. Do you agree?
It would be better to renegotiate it, to redesign it, and to integrate it straight away into the European Treaty. We can implement almost everything that's in the fiscal pact using conventional procedures. The European Parliament is quick to make decisions, the Council is slow, but we have to renegotiate. Today, young people are going to Angola, Argentina, to Brazil to find jobs. That's not what Europe is about. François Hollande's central message is that we need another Europe that, above all, acts in young people's interests so they can find work.
Wir brauchen ein anderes Europa, das sich vor allem auch die Jugend kümmert, dass sie wieder einen Job bekommt.
Hannes Swoboda, chairman of the Socialists in the European Parliament, thanks for talking to DW.
Bitte sehr gern.